An unexpected visit in the heart of Manhattan. Susan Miller was enjoying the quiet luxury of her 73rd spring from her 12th floor condo on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was a typical Tuesday. Sunlight spilled across gleaming wooden floors, the city's distant hum barely audible above the gentle soundtrack of a daytime drama playing on her big-screen TV. The air was scented faintly with blooming tulips from her balcony planters. Outside, the cherry blossoms along Riverside Park were in full riot. Pink and white confetti frame her skyline views. Absorbed in the slow-burning intrigue of her favorite soap opera, Susan's focus was abruptly jolted as the shrill chime of the doorbell sliced through the stillness. She nearly spilled her mug of chamomile tea, startled, as no one, except for Maria the housekeeper who only came on Fridays, ever rang her bell unannounced. Rolling her eyes at her own reaction, Susan placed her mug on the marble countertop and instinctively smoothed back her silver hair before crossing to the security console near the entrance. She pressed the intercom screen. The camera revealed something Susan had not anticipated in years: her only son John Miller and his wife Hannah, standing side by side at her apartment door. John, tall and athletic despite the first traces of middle age, looked upright but tense, his smile a little too forced. Hannah's fashionably cut blonde hair shielded part of her face. She cradled a lavish bouquet wrapped in white tissue. Both wore carefully neutral expressions like actors awaiting their cues. Susan's breath caught in her throat. John and Hannah weren't the sort to drop by for a casual visit. In fact, other than Thanksgiving and her birthday, she could count on one hand the number of times they'd appeared at her doorstep since moving to the city from Boston 7 years ago. Their visits had always felt a bit obligatory, exchanges of gifts and clipped small talk, more ceremonial than heartfelt. She hesitated. For a split second Susan considered pretending she wasn't home, but reason, and curiosity, prevailed. She pressed unlock on the panel and watched, heart pounding, as the lock on the heavy lacquered door slid open. "Hi, Mom," John greeted her, stepping in with a high-end basket brimming with imported fruit. Grapes, mangoes, black plums, the works. He briefly attempted an embrace, awkwardly patting her shoulder. "You look well, it's been too long." Susan smiled, searching his face for some hint of genuine warmth. There was a practiced quality to his concern, a lawyer's way of weighing every word. Hannah swept in after him, setting the bouquet, a mix of fragrant peonies and rainbow-hued tulips, on the granite foyer table. "Hi, Susan, it was just such a beautiful day. We thought we'd surprise you," Hannah chirped, her cheer slightly too bright to ring true. Susan's mind, always sharp, filed these gestures away with suspicion. In 5 years, Hannah had never once inquired about what flowers Susan liked, nor brought a single stem on any previous visit. The elaborate bouquet, the fruit, none of it felt organic for this couple, who were usually closer to practical than sentimental. Behind her, the apartment's open living space gleamed in the afternoon light, her elegant cream sofas, a few family photos arranged with mathematical perfection, a grand piano she hadn't played in months. She kept her apartment in magazine-ready condition, a side effect of a lifetime habit. Prepare for any contingency, including surprise guests. "Is there a special occasion I've forgotten?" she asked, her tone neutral but edged with the faintest skepticism. John shook his head, glancing to Hannah. "No, not really, we just realized it had been a while and wanted to drop in. Catch up, you know?" His words sounded practiced, rehearsed. Susan forced herself to relax, beckoning them into the living room where the afternoon light drew long golden slats across her Persian rug. "Can I get you both something?" she offered, gesturing to the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "Coffee? Tea? Something stronger?" "Tea would be wonderful," Hannah replied, her voice softer, "if it's no trouble." As Susan bent over her ornately carved tea chest, she tried to recall the last time mother and daughter-in-law had shared a moment alone. In her recollection, their every prior encounter, weddings, birthdays, holidays, was marked by polite but chilly exchanges, punctuated by Hannah's frequent glances at her phone and John's distracted humming about work. Yet today, there was a different energy, something less easy to name, an edginess, or perhaps anticipation. A tense, expectant quiet settled between them as the kettle came to a boil. Susan asked polite questions about their commute, John's work at the financial firm, the theater scene, small talk that both parties knew was just that, small, inconsequential, a way to fill the space. "It really is a gorgeous view you have," Hannah finally said as she stirred her tea, her green eyes darting to the panorama of city rooftops in Central Park visible over Susan's balcony. "Thank you," Susan replied, smiling thinly. "I find the city very peaceful from up here. But I can't help but wonder, she continued, fixing John with a look she'd honed over decades as both a mother and a professional. What brings you to my door on a weekday afternoon? There was a slight tick in John's jaw, a tell Susan had known since he was a boy and lied about eating extra cookies. We just wanted to check in on you, Mom, he said, pausing deliberately. We worry you might get lonely all the way up here by yourself. Susan snorted. I'm rarely lonely, John. I rather enjoy my own company. And with Bridge Club, my book group, your Aunt Maggie calling me every night. She allowed her teasing to hang in the air, eyes flicking from son to daughter-in-law. Really? Is there something you need? Is everything all right? A silence settled, edged with something tense and unnamed. Hannah reached for her hand, her smile sweet yet oddly formal. Susan, we really do care about you, she said softly. You've always been so independent, but maybe you could use a break, that's all. Instantly, Susan's mind cataloged the moment, forced warmth, a scripted gentleness that raised more questions than it answered. She sipped her tea, regarding her guests over the rim of fine bone china, the city's afternoon blaze at her back. The unexpectedness of this visit, its staged generosity and precision, struck her all over again. She had no inkling yet what storm was gathering beyond her tranquil windows, what dark new chapter was about to unfold among the towers of Manhattan. But in the hush of the apartment, with sunlight glancing off expensive fruit and unfamiliar flowers perfuming the air, Susan Miller felt for the first time in years a prickle of real unease. She set down her cup and drew a deep breath, determined to maintain her composure, a Manhattanite's armor against the unpredictable. Well, she said with gentle authority, it seems we have all afternoon. Why don't you tell me what's truly brought you here? And so, in the heart of the world's busiest city, amid the calm and order she'd spent a lifetime curating, Susan Miller realized her old skills, observation, restraint, intuition, were about to be tested in ways she'd never expected. The city pulsed beneath her windows, uncaring, but in this living room, something delicate was at risk, a trust, a bond, her hard-earned peace, and Susan braced herself as the shadows shifted for whatever was coming next. The strange proposal, a healing trip to Japan. The tea in Susan's cup had barely begun to cool, when the subtle tension in the room crystallized into something more pointed. John fidgeted, his eyes flickering with the same restlessness that had always preceded his difficult conversations. Hannah clicked her nails quietly against her teacup and with a glance that passed quickly between husband and wife, she broke the silence with a bright, rehearsed smile. So Susan, I know this is coming out of the blue, Hannah began, her tone lilting as if she were about to reveal a party surprise. But we have a little proposal for you. Susan, who had prided herself on reading subtext, both in the boardroom and the living room, sat up straighter, spine stiffening ever so subtly. Proposals from her son and daughter-in-law were exceedingly rare, and, in her experience, seldom to her benefit. She watched as John nervously cleared his throat, then launched into what sounded very much like a sales pitch. Hannah and I have been thinking. You work so hard, you've been so strong, especially since Dad passed. Maybe it's time you took a real break, Mom. You deserve something different, refreshing. Susan's eyebrows rose. She was rarely caught off guard and was not in the habit of being managed even by her own family. A break? She echoed. From what exactly? The silence that followed was pregnant, filled with words not being spoken. From your routines, from your solitude, perhaps from us and all our lacking. John pressed on. Yes, a break, a real adventure. Actually, we've been planning a trip, and we bought you a ticket to Japan. Hannah clasped her hands together, her enthusiasm carefully modulated. It's for next week. Everything's already arranged. Flights, hotels, even the itinerary. 5 stars, of course. John thought you and I could go, just the two of us. Girls' trip. The world stopped for a split second. Japan? The idea was so far outside the norms of their relationship, so starkly at odds with the measured, distant affection that typically defined them, that for a moment Susan wondered if she'd misheard. She searched their faces for a motive. John appeared anxious but hopeful, while Hannah's smile was brittle, as if pasted on for a photo she'd rather skip. Susan's mind raced. Why now, after years of detached civility, were they urgently suggesting a cross-continental vacation? Aloud, she said calmly, "That's incredibly generous, but unnecessary. Has something happened? Why suddenly Japan?" She watched her question hit the air, and saw the way the couple's eyes met, a brief and silent negotiation. John reached into his briefcase and produced a large envelope. He slid the envelope across the table with forced casualness. "We just think it'd be good for you, Mom. You don't spend enough time with Hannah? Maybe you can bond, see the world, get some rest. You said your back was bothering you lately and the onsens in Japan do wonders for, well, everything. He tried for levity but landed on awkwardness. Susan opened the envelope to find a set of glossy travel documents including flight confirmations, hotel reservations for a luxury resort outside Tokyo, and a detailed, almost obsessively so, daily itinerary. There were also brochures on healing hot springs and cultural immersion experiences for seniors. She set the papers down, fingers lingering on their polished surfaces. What struck her, more than the extravagant offer, was the immaculate preparedness of it all. The way every detail had been pre-selected, every option chosen for her, as if her autonomy were a mere afterthought. Hannah leaned in, lowering her voice. "Susan, I know this isn't like us, but we thought... You lost yourself a bit after Mr. Miller passed, and maybe I haven't really tried enough to..." She trailed off, her eyes wet with something that looked disturbingly like guilt. Though Susan couldn't be sure if it was genuine or simply a well-executed performance. Susan was nothing, if not pragmatic. "You expect me," she said levelly, "to up and leave with barely a week's notice, to a country halfway across the planet with you?" John interjected, "I promise everything's paid for, Mom. You'll have your own suite. Hannah knows some Japanese, she'll look after you. Really, the trip is for you. You deserve to be cared for." The implication, that she'd somehow grown incapable, was not lost on her. Susan, whose pride in her independence bordered on stubbornness, felt a flare of resentment. Still, she weighed her words. They were acting too eager, too rehearsed. Her instincts, honed through decades of family politics and high-stakes business deals, pricked sharply at the edges. She pressed further. "Surely if this trip is so important, John, you'd want to come with us?" He shook his head, a sheepish smile touching his lips. "I wish, Mom, but with work, there's a merger coming up. I simply can't get away. Besides, I think it might be... better, you two spending one-on-one time." A beat missed. "You girls will have fun." "Fun?" Susan thought. It was the word people used when they wanted to distract you from something deeper. She regarded her son and his wife in the sharp Manhattan sunlight, feeling suddenly as if her living room was a stage set, and she was the only one not privy to the script. Hannah was quick to reassure. "I really do want this, Susan. I want us to be closer. And I researched it all, local tours, English-speaking guides. I already mapped out the food, everything's gluten-free for you." She paused. "Trust us. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see Kyoto in spring, the cherry blossoms, the gardens? You could finally relax." For the briefest moment, Susan felt temptation flicker, an answering call from years of deferred dreams. She had longed for a trip like this once after her husband died, only to cancel every time out of guilt or routine or a sense of pointlessness. Maybe there was something to gain from stepping away, maybe. But her rational mind kicked in, steady as always. Unbidden, a memory surfaced of John pleading for loans or advances, quietly referencing his tight situation without specifics. She remembered the recent news articles about vulnerable seniors targeted abroad, lured into situations where safety depended upon others' goodwill. Yet, her face revealed none of this. "Can I think it over?" she said quietly, her lips curling in practiced graciousness. Hannah nodded, visibly relieved, sensing victory. "Of course, but just imagine it, a trip to remember, just us, a chance to really make new memories together." Susan smiled, but kept her true thoughts behind a measured mask. In the comfortable elegance of her Manhattan sanctuary, her world had tilted, pivoted perhaps toward hidden agendas she had yet to uncover. What lay behind this strange generosity? Concern, love, or something darker? In the silence that followed, the city's sounds, distant sirens, a bark from the street, the muted rumble of the subway, filtered through the double-glazed windows. John sipped his tea with studied calm. Hannah eyed her with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation. And Susan, always adept at reading the heartbeat of a room, knew without question that her answer to this strange proposal would mark the beginning of an altogether unexpected chapter. Even as she nodded, maintaining the appearance of familial trust, she resolved to guard her every step. For in Manhattan, as in life, generosity rarely came free, and trust, once broken, could become its own kind of exotic journey. Warning signs. In the heady aftermath of her son and daughter-in-law's dramatic proposal, Susan found herself both unsettled and oddly invigorated. For the next several days she drifted through her familiar routines, morning walks through Central Park, afternoons browsing at the Strand, evenings curled up with a novel in her sun-flooded den, but with a new undercurrent of distrust threading through her thoughts. She tried to convince herself it was irrational, even ungracious. After all, what kind of mother doubts the motives behind her child's generosity? Yet she couldn't shake the sense that something beneath the gleaming surface of John and Hannah's offer didn't quite add up. The first hint came 2 nights later. Susan was sorting through mail in her kitchen when her phone buzzed. It was John, his number popping up after weeks without a single call. Uncharacteristically, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Hey Mom," he started, his voice sounding tight. "Just checking in, seeing if you've decided about Japan. Hannah's super excited. Oh, and," his tone shifted, casual but with an edge, "you'll remember to bring your bank books and any documents, right? You know, just in case you need to transfer money or something goes wrong with your cards over there." Susan paused mid-step, fingers tightening their grip on the edge of an electric bill. For decades, she'd kept her financial affairs under careful control, never once traveling with more than a credit card unless absolutely required. The idea of toting proof of her assets across the world struck her as absurd and deeply unsafe. She kept her reply neutral. "I'll bring what I need, just my cards. Japan isn't a cash-only country after all." She could practically feel John's disappointment travel the line, though he masked it quickly with a laugh. The second warning sign arrived the next afternoon when Hannah called to offer help with packing. Her voice was syrupy, lingering beneath each question just a little too long. "Susan, maybe I should stop by tomorrow. I can help you decide what to take," Hannah offered. "Especially the important stuff, like, you know, passports and legal papers maybe." Susan thanked her but declined. "I've traveled alone plenty of times, dear. I think I'm still capable of packing my own bag." She hung up and stood very still in her kitchen, the whir of the refrigerator filling the silence. Since when did Hannah care about passports and legal papers? For that matter, since when did anyone in her family show interest in her personal business, or attempt to micromanage it? Unease blossomed into vigilance. She spent the following morning preparing in her own way, drawing on old habits formed during tougher days. Susan retrieved the lockbox from the back of her walk-in closet. Her late husband's gold wristwatch, a collection of heirloom rings, about $5,000 in emergency cash saved over years for moments just like this. She tucked the pouch at the very bottom of a side pocket in her roller bag, hidden beneath a false lining. Her passport and credit cards she attached to a money belt that would never leave her person. All the while she questioned herself. Was this paranoia or practicality? Had years of living alone in Manhattan, watching documentaries about financial fraud and betrayal, colored her perception too much? But then came the third sign. A conversation with her hairdresser, Marissa, at the Upper West Side salon she'd frequented for decades. Susan mentioned her upcoming trip, and Marissa chatted about the joys of traveling. "That's so lovely, Susan! You traveling with anyone?" Susan hesitated, then explained. Without prompting or drama, Marissa simply nodded sympathetically. "Japan is safe, but careful with company, even family. I've had older clients, you know, taken on fancy trips by kids, for not-so-nice reasons. Sorry to make you nervous." Susan laughed it off, but the comment echoed in her mind as she walked home through Broadway's afternoon bustle. By that night, Susan's vigilance had reached a kind of quiet resolve. She unzipped a leather journal and started scribbling, lists of emergency contacts, instructions for her lawyer, reminders to never relinquish her passport. She even typed out a quick email to Robert Park, her attorney, letting him know she'd be traveling and to verify any unusual requests for access to her accounts or property. The next morning John called again. "Hey Mom, did you pack up your stuff yet?" His voice pushed, as if searching for a crack in her composure. "Just double-checking. Did you get your documents together? Your property deeds or anything might be useful if we run into trouble? You never know with foreign banks." Susan inhaled deeply, her answer steelier than before. "No, John, I'm not bringing anything but what the State Department recommends for international travel. If I need money, I'll call my bank directly from Tokyo." There was silence, pregnant, awkward, long enough for her to imagine John weighing whether to press further. But he caved, quickly changing the subject to flight details and taxi pickups. Hours later, as Susan set about folding her clothes into neatly labeled packing cubes, she reviewed Hannah's itinerary printouts one more time. Every reservation was in Hannah's name, with Susan tagged along as a guest. Every dinner, every tour, every transfer, planned with the precision of a military operation, but with none of the usual charm Hannah displayed when planning girls' nights in Boston years ago. And no accommodations for Susan to bring her own friends, or for free time apart from Hannah. Everything was curated, contained. For the first time in her life, Susan felt the full gravity of having her independence not just questioned, but actively managed for her. She remembered her father's old advice. which he'd muttered into her ear before she left for Vassar decades ago. Always keep a little in reserve, Susie. Trust's a precious thing, but it's meant to be earned, not given. That night she tucked an extra pack of emergency cash in her bra, double-checked her international phone plan, and wrote her doorman a note requesting he keep a watchful eye on her apartment during her absence. There was no telling what else her family might try while she was away. By the time Hannah texted, "All set, can't wait for our adventure together," Susan's reply, "Looking forward to it, see you in the morning," masked the flurry of doubt and the crisp, cold clarity of resolve swirling deep inside her chest. She wasn't sure what awaited her in Japan. But whatever it was, Susan Miller knew one thing: she would not be caught unaware. An uneasy journey. The morning of their departure arrived cloaked in a gray drizzle that dulled even the city's usual energy. Susan awoke before her alarm, anxiety coursing through her veins like strong coffee. She showered, buttoned herself into her favorite navy travel sweater, and checked her suitcase for the 5th time. A careful inventory of clothing, toiletries, prescription meds, emergency cash, hidden valuables, phone chargers, and a small folder of essential paperwork. She left her jewelry and checkbooks at home. Her bank cards, passport, and a pocket-sized card with her lawyer's number stayed in a money belt nestled beneath her shirt. Her apartment felt oddly still as she completed a mental rundown of precautions. She left her doorman, with whom she'd shared more details than usual, a sealed envelope detailing her itinerary and lawyer's number. Just in case. It all felt slightly dramatic, and yet a voice inside reminded her that caution was, if nothing else, good sense. At precisely 7 a.m., Hannah appeared in the lobby, surprisingly early, beaming with a wide, artificial smile. "Morning, Susan. I caught a rideshare. It was so easy. Here, let me take your suitcase." She reached for it before Susan could object, and Susan had to assert with gentle firmness, "I'll manage, thanks. Some things never change, right?" Even then, something about Hannah's over-eager helpfulness made her hackles rise. She'd always been polite, but today she hovered, fussed, and double-checked every detail. The seatbelt position in the taxi, the weather updates, repeatedly asking if Susan had all her documents and if her phone was fully charged. If indeed Hannah was trying to play the thoughtful daughter-in-law, she was laying it on too thick. The drive to JFK crawled through morning traffic, but inside the cab, Hannah's monologue about Kyoto's temples, Shibuya's neon, and Tokyo's culinary delights was relentless. Susan responded with occasional smiles or nods, attention split between the passing cityscape and Hannah's phone, which buzzed repeatedly with text messages. Hannah would glance at it and type, at times using her body to block Susan's view of the screen. Once, as they paused at a light, Susan caught a flicker of a text. "She's all set, ready when—" The rest vanished beneath Hannah's thumb. At the airport the travel unease only grew. Hannah kept offering to keep the passports safe or to double-check the boarding passes. Susan brushed her off, politely but firmly. "I'll hold on to those, thanks, Hannah." An awkward silence followed. Hannah's smile flickered for just a second. "Of course, just thinking of convenience," she breathed, and busied herself with the luggage tags. Security, customs, and check-in all passed without incident, but Susan was hyper-aware of every detail. Fellow passengers, Hannah's mannerisms, the location of exits, her own belongings. Every time Hannah offered to get bottled water or snacks, Susan checked her bag as soon as she was out of sight. These instincts, she knew, were born of deep-seated wariness she hadn't felt since her working years overseeing large financial deals. They finally boarded, with Susan maneuvering herself into the window seat and Hannah taking the aisle. Once seated, Hannah began to chatter with a forced enthusiasm that bordered on manic. "Isn't it so exciting? You'll love Japan, Susan. I've planned every stop down to the minute." She handed over a color-coded folder labeled Our Adventure, packed with printed tickets, hotel confirmations, and spreadsheets. Susan noted that almost all the booking emails were under Hannah's account, not her own. As the plane's engines rumbled to life, Susan stared out over the rain-lashed tarmac, her hometown fading behind her, both physically and, she feared, metaphorically. She felt a sudden pang of loss, not just for the comfort of her routine, but for the certainty she'd always found in her own company. In the seat beside her, Hannah was texting again, fingers moving fast. Susan caught another fleeting glimpse of a message. "Landing at Narita as planned. Be ready." She wasn't sure whether the tremor that ran through her was fear or anger, but she resolved then and there to take nothing for granted. Not long after takeoff, Hannah transformed from chatty to attentive, frequently asking if Susan needed a blanket, offered her tea, and at one odd moment, reached across to adjust Susan's reading light. The movements felt almost rehearsed, as if Hannah were playing some version of perfect care, while keeping Susan diverted from the practical matters of travel. Airborne over the Atlantic, the cabin descended into a hush. Many passengers slept. Susan tried, but every doze was interrupted by bursts of nervous wakefulness. She squeezed her money belt, reassured by the tactile proof that her essentials remained with her. Later in the flight, the attendants passed down the aisles with dinner trays. Hannah deftly organized both of their meals, even going so far as to swap forks and trays so that Susan barely needed to move. "Just relax, I've got you," Hannah said too brightly. Susan felt her throat constrict, but forced herself to eat. During a rare trip to the restroom, Susan decided to check her phone. Among several notifications were 2 missed calls from Robert Park, her attorney, and a short, cryptic text. "All looks good so far, please check in when landed." She hesitated before responding, not wanting Hannah to see any suspicious activity. She was also determined not to signal her anxiety. Not yet. Returning to her seat, she noticed Hannah's phone, carelessly unlocked and open on the tray. It was only for a split second, but she caught sight of something. A text conversation with someone labeled JM that read, "Don't worry, everything's on schedule, she has no clue, we'll text next steps after arrival." Her nerves, already taut, hummed with adrenaline. She slid into her seat, feigning a stifled yawn. "I think I'll try to get some sleep," she told Hannah, who offered a gentle smile and tucked a blanket over Susan's lap. But sleep didn't come. The gentle rocking of the plane only seemed to amplify her fears. During the long night, Susan ran through every step of the trip in her head. Her escape options, the nearest embassy, emergency contacts, all the warnings in travel forums about travelers left stranded abroad under suspicious circumstances. There was no single moment of revelation, only a slow but relentless gathering of clouds, the controlling nature of every plan, the fixation on her documents, the concealed communication. Her own son, her own daughter-in-law, what could they truly be after? Dana, the stewardess, paused at one point, offering Susan a glass of water, and perhaps noticing the tension in her jaw, asked in a low voice, "Is everything okay?" Susan smiled and thanked her, but deep down she registered Dana's kindness as a pinprick of hope. If things went wrong, she'd need allies, even strangers. As dawn crept in through the tiny window and Japan's coastline neared, Susan's mind sharpened. She would act as if nothing were wrong, she would smile graciously, follow the plan precisely as Hannah had designed it, and all the while she would search for her moment to act. For now all she could do was breathe, keep her senses wide open, and remember her father's words. Trust no one until you're certain of their heart. With a new day breaking over the Pacific, and a shadowy uncertainty coiling in her chest, Susan Miller braced herself for whatever awaited on the ground. The most challenging journey of her life, she suspected, had only just begun. The chilling truth. Unveiled at 30,000 feet high above the Pacific, while hundreds of passengers were lost in uneasy sleep or entranced by glowing screens, Susan Miller occupied a small, strange island of tension and fear. Jet engines thrummed beneath the plane's hushed interior. The world outside was a void, clouds, darkness, and the monotone whisper of wind against metal. The supposed adventure with her daughter-in-law unfolded with a gnawing sense of unreality. The night had stretched on, Hannah's vigilance never slackening, a smile here, an offer of tea there, the relentless, performative care. Yet between all the gentle gestures, Susan noticed how Hannah kept glancing at her phone, sometimes sliding it beneath her thigh as if to hide it at Susan's slightest glance. It became clear that whatever was happening involved more than sightseeing and hot springs. Shortly after midnight in Tokyo local time, the plane's cabin was dimmed for sleep. Most lights were off, except for a few passengers quietly reading. Hannah, after another flurry of texting, finally laid her head back, mouth set in a tense, almost determined line. Within minutes her breaths grew slow and regular. Susan's eyes, heavy but lucid, drifted over her daughter-in-law to the tray table, where Hannah had left her phone. The device's screen, in a small act of providence, flared with a notification, a message preview, illuminated for just a few seconds. Susan's heart hammered with a manic mixture of dread and curiosity. She looked around. The aisle was empty, the attendants farther down the galley. She reached for the phone with trembling hands, cursing the sweat that slicked her palm. To her astonishment, the screen was unlocked, whether by accident or Hannah's haste, she didn't know. At a glance, she saw the messaging app open to a recent conversation labeled JM, her son. With thudding horror, she began to read. JM, confirmed her bank info. Amount is more than expected. H, it'll be easier once we're there. Tokyo's crowded, nobody will notice. JM. After you lose her, start the countdown. Lawyer says 7 years and then we can claim the whole estate. H. She doesn't suspect a thing, she can't speak Japanese and she hates asking for help. JM. Don't mess up, Hannah. Remember, you have to make it look like an accident. Now's our best chance. Susan's blood ran cold. She read the exchange again, each word slicing deeper. Her own son, discussing her disappearance as though she were an item to be lost, a problematic package to be conveniently misdelivered on foreign soil. The plan was clear. Abandon her somewhere alone and vulnerable. Then simply wait, inheriting everything if she died or remained missing for 7 years. For half a minute paralysis took her. Adrenaline warred with disbelief, her shaking fingers almost dropped the phone. She scrolled, desperate for context, a history that might make this nightmare less real. But there was more. Messages from days and weeks before about renewing travel insurance, researching inheritance law, and even checking timelines for declaring a parent legally deceased abroad. Susan began to sweat. A wave of bile rose in her throat. She had always believed herself shrewd, sometimes a little paranoid. But how had she failed to imagine this? How desperate must John be, how far gone to conspire with his wife to make his own mother disappear? She should have trusted her instincts, every warning sign over the past few weeks now glaringly obvious. She slid the phone back onto Hannah's tray, careful to place it as she had found it, and immediately pressed herself into the seat. Her heart felt as if it might crack her ribs. She fought for composure as Hannah stirred, stretching and casting a quick, suspicious glance. "Everything okay, Susan?" she murmured, voice sticky with false concern. Susan forced a small, exhausted smile. "Just restless," she managed. "Do you have any more water?" Hannah handed her a bottle and turned away, apparently satisfied. Inside, Susan's mind spun, sick with betrayal and icy dread. She could not allow herself to panic. She ran through her options. Cause a scene now? Confront Hannah? She rejected both. On a plane halfway to Tokyo, her best defense was to hide the truth that she knew, acting just as trusting, just as subdued as before. "I have to survive this," she thought. "I have to get off this plane. I have to make it to the embassy. I have to get word to someone I can trust." The consequences of failure were final. She could vanish forever in a city where she didn't speak a word, freshly cut off from help, and John and Hannah would walk away with the spoils of her hard work and her late husband's bequest. As minutes ticked toward dawn and the sun's first threads crept along the horizon's edge, Susan sat bolt upright in her seat. The rest of the flight was a torturous exercise in control. She repeated in her mind the crucial facts, what she'd seen, what she must remember, what she must do. She tricked herself into nerves about lost luggage, steeled her expression against every tremor of fear. She came up with a plan. At the first opportunity after landing, before baggage claim, before leaving security, she would find an airline agent or consular officer or police and refuse to let Hannah out of her sight until she had explained everything. The weight of decades, of love, of trust, of motherhood, pressed down on her, threatening to break her. And yet, in that crucible of 30,000 feet, Susan Miller found a bitter, ferocious strength. She would survive, not just for herself, but as a protest against the hideous betrayal that had taken root within her own family. As the plane began its descent into Japan, her mind whirred through contingency plans. The city below looked both thrilling and suddenly menacing, a maze in which she could be lost on purpose unless she outsmarted her enemies. The chilling truth had shattered any lingering hope. Now came the fight to endure, and ultimately, to prevail. Unexpected ally in perilous circumstances. The wheels shrieked against the tarmac at Narita International Airport, jolting Susan out of her grim reverie. Her breathing was shallow, every nerve on edge as she reminded herself over and over, act natural, act oblivious. Overhead bins popped, buckles clicked, passengers rustled in their seats. Susan's mind raced. She rehearsed the English and the little Japanese she remembered from an ancient tourist pamphlet. Help, embassy, police, anything that would draw attention if needed. She waited while Hannah busied herself digging for their passports, a plastic smile firmly plastered to her face. All around them the crowd funneled into sluggish lines, shuffling through customs with practiced apathy. Susan kept her head low, blending in, eyes searching for authority, someone with a badge, someone in uniform, anyone who looked kind. Before they reached the counter, Hannah leaned close and hissed, "Stay with me, Susan. I'll handle everything." Something about the command, the false sweetness in Hannah's voice, sent a ripple of fury through Susan. But she had to be careful, showing her hand now could be fatal. A few feet from customs, a tall flight attendant, Dana, with wise eyes and a calm face, emerged from the reboarding queue. She caught Susan's eye, holding her gaze just half a heartbeat too long. It was enough. At that moment Susan broke away from Hannah with a quiet, "Oh, I forgot my phone charger on board," and turned toward Dana. The attendant immediately recognized her distress, dropping her clipboard. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" she asked softly in perfectly accented English. Susan, using every ounce of composure, replied through a clenched whisper, "Yes, I'm in danger. My life, my son, my daughter-in-law. They want to hurt me. I have proof." Dana's professionalism didn't waver, but her eyes flared with sudden purpose. "Follow me. Airport security can help. Just stay close. Don't look back." She led Susan briskly past an astonished Hannah, merging them into a group of airline staff. Dana's arm didn't leave Susan's back until they reached a private staff corridor near an emergency exit where a security guard stood. In the small, fluorescent-lit office that followed, Susan explained everything with breathless precision, unlocking her money belt to retrieve her notes, and then describing the messages she'd seen on Hannah's phone. All the while, Dana translated swift, urgent Japanese to the guard, who radioed for supervisors. Paperwork, identities, even embassy representatives materialized in what felt like a blur. Hannah's presence loomed outside the glass, pacing, texting, flustered, unable to reach Susan. Dana's calm steadied her, advocating on Susan's behalf, never letting the officials dismiss her story as mere family drama. When Susan was too tired to speak, Dana stepped in, vouching for Susan's visible fear and composure throughout the flight. By the time a U.S. Embassy officer arrived, Susan felt something she hadn't known in days, the first stirrings of safety. Dana squeezed her hand, quietly promising to watch Hannah's movements until all was resolved. It wasn't the embassy paperwork or threatening legal jargon that saved Susan Miller in the end. It was the quick, silent compassion of a stranger with a keen eye and a willingness to step forward. Sometimes, Susan would later realize, a single ally can change the entire shape of disaster. In the vast machinery of Narita Airport, among uniformed faces and indifferent crowds, Susan found her lifeline, an unexpected ally who helped her reclaim her future. Battle in the heart of Tokyo, escape and rescue. The city of Tokyo, sprawling and electric, unfolded beneath Susan like an impossible maze. As the airport debacle faded and she was whisked away with the help of her unexpected ally Dana, Susan was acutely aware that the danger wasn't quite over. Safe for the moment within the secure walls of a consular waiting room, adrenaline still pulsed through her system, her mind replaying every detail of the conspiracy she'd narrowly escaped. After the embassy officer reassured her again that she would be protected, Susan's resolve only grew fiercer. She insisted on providing a full statement, requesting that her communications with John and Hannah be monitored, and advised the authorities about what she had uncovered on the flight. The American staff made arrangements for her immediate safety, but before long, the reality of being in a foreign land, cut off from familiar routines, began to weigh on her. They escorted her to a small hotel used for high-risk expatriates, anonymous and discreet. That night Susan barely slept, images of Hannah's calculated smile and John's chilling betrayal looping through her mind. The next morning, she was informed that local police and U.S. authorities were working together to piece together the couple's scheme, but it was only a matter of time before they realized she had slipped from their grasp. A sense of dread returned. Tokyo was vast, filled with strangers, and no plan was perfect. Even with the support of embassy staff, Susan felt vulnerable, haunted by the idea that someone might be following, that her would-be captors might get desperate and reckless. Determined to reclaim some measure of agency, Susan worked closely with the embassy and local officers, mapping out each step she might need to take: escape routes, nearby safe spaces, emergency codes in Japanese written phonetically in her notebook. She learned how to navigate Tokyo's labyrinthine train system, practicing routes until she could reach the embassy on autopilot if needed. Every time she stepped out for groceries or an embassy appointment, she scanned the crowds, eyes darting for familiar faces amid the sea of commuters. Then, as dusk fell on her third day in Tokyo, her worst fears materialized. Susan noticed a man trailing her in the Ginza district, his face partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. Ducking into a busy convenience store, she used the techniques taught by the embassy team, circling aisles, watching in reflection, timing her exit with a group of locals. Still, the man loitered nearby when she returned to the street. Susan's phone buzzed, A message from an unknown number written in halting English. Do not go home. Danger! Wait for help! Her heart stuttered, but Dana, who had checked on her daily since their flight, answered her frantic call within moments. Stay where you are. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't speak to anyone you don't know. As the minutes dragged on, Susan feigned browsing in the magazine aisle, heart pounding as a shadow paused just outside the glass. True to her word, Dana arrived. Cool, calm, blending in with the after-work crowd. She guided Susan through a maze of back streets and small alleys, finally slipping into an entrance marked only by a tiny red lantern, a neighborhood soba shop, crowded and anonymous. Here, with bowls of steaming noodles between them, they laid low while Dana spoke to embassy security and Tokyo police. The hours ticked by in anxious silence, broken only by the slurping of patrons and the clatter from the kitchen. Dana kept her eyes on the door, quietly relaying updates. Police are moving in, they traced calls, your family's making inquiries, the embassy's on alert. Just as Susan's nerves frayed to the edge, officers in plain clothes entered the shop, slipping Dana and Susan out the back. With a flurry of coordinated movement that felt to Susan both cinematic and terrifyingly real, the team swept them into an unmarked car bound for a secure police precinct. There, Susan would finally face questions not of guilt, but of how she had survived, and astonishingly, how she had managed to outsmart those who meant her harm. Inside the precinct, the stark reality of her ordeal settled over Susan with a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. Questions flowed, from police, embassy officials, even Japanese social workers, each detail carefully documented. You did everything right, one officer commented, nodding at her notes and prepared escape routes. As dawn broke beyond the barred windows, relief washed over her. John and Hannah, learning of Susan's unexpected survival, were intercepted at their hotel by law enforcement responding to embassy alerts. The evidence, digital trails, airline records, Susan's own testimony, was overwhelming. Susan knew her struggle was far from over, that the legal aftermath and the wounds inflicted by family betrayal would take time to heal. Yet, sitting in that Tokyo police station flanked by her embassy ally Dana and a small team of advocates, Susan felt a new certainty kindling inside. She had wrested her future from the brink, right in the heart of Tokyo, a city she'd once feared would swallow her whole. Now she looked out at the neon-streaked sky and for the first time in weeks allowed herself to hope that rescue and perhaps even healing was truly possible. Put an end to forgiveness. After the chaos, the endless hours of police interviews and the sleepless nights in an unfamiliar hotel room tucked somewhere above the electric veins of Tokyo, Susan found herself sitting alone, staring out at neon-lit rain as it cast shimmering patterns on the window pane. Her nerves had yet to settle. Even surrounded by layers of consular staff, local officers, and a newfound sense of physical safety, she was haunted by the raw wound of betrayal. Over the coming days, as the shock receded into a bone-deep exhaustion, she caught herself in flashes of disbelief. Each time her phone vibrated, she expected it to be John's familiar ringtone or Hannah's clipped text. But instead, the communications were sterile, official, women's advocacy groups from the embassy, officers assuring her of every procedural next step, her attorney relaying empathetic yet firm legal advice. It was the aftermath, what was supposed to be the part where mothers and sons, families shattered by crisis, find their way back to one another, that Susan realized she had stubbed out her capacity to forgive. This ending would not be softened by nostalgic memories or second chances. In the past, Susan had built her life on patience and understanding, patching over cracks in other people's temperaments, making excuses for slights and small betrayals in the service of keeping the peace. She had been raised on the gospel of family unity, a tenet that insisted the blood bond was worth any number of apologies, any test of endurance. But staring at her reflection on the rain-streaked glass, she confronted what felt like a cold, necessary clarity. Forgiveness was not always a virtue, sometimes it was surrender. The police investigation moved quickly, prodded along by international attention and the undeniable digital evidence Susan had so painstakingly uncovered. John and Hannah, their hotel room raided and their plans exposed, tried to reach her through intermediaries. Tearful voicemails, desperate pleas through lawyers, even social media posts cloaked in apology. Each message landed like a stone in Susan's chest, but did nothing to stir regret about her new resolve. Day by day, Susan rebuilt her emotional defenses, reconstructing routines with a profound wariness. Where once she might have searched for signs of reconciliation, a lowered voice, a hopeful phrase, the smallest act of humility, Now she saw only the reality of manipulation, the stomach-turning memory of cold calculation in her own son's digital voice. She deleted their messages and blocked their numbers. The embassy arranged for her safe return, flanked by the sort of government escorts reserved for witnesses in organized crime cases. On the long flight home, she allowed herself to mourn, not just her husband or the years she lost to family, but her own innocence in believing that forgiveness was always possible, or even deserved. As New York's skyline came into view, Susan felt lighter, stripped of the binding obligation to forgive, free now to choose distance over reconciliation. She wrote a new will, updated her power of attorney, notified every bank and legal office. Not out of vengeance, but out of self-preservation, and hard-won self-respect. Months passed and the story faded from the headlines. Friends called, sometimes asking if she'd thought about reaching out, if forgiveness might be possible with time. But Susan drew a boundary as solid as the apartment walls she cherished. The world could turn, grief could dull, but what had been broken inside her would not be repaired by displays of remorse. Instead, she poured her energy into herself, the woman who had survived, who had trusted her instincts, who learned to draw safety and companionship from unexpected places. Coffee with Dana, now back in New York as a visiting friend, regular check-ins with her lawyer and accountant, weekend ventures out to old favorite haunts and new, each step a small act of self-rescue. Forgiveness, she discovered, is not synonymous with peace. The end of forgiveness was not the beginning of bitterness, but rather a reclamation of her own borderlines. She could fiercely grieve her son and the memory of her family, but she could also fiercely guard the hard-won serenity that came with having survived. Sometimes, the healthiest love you can give, to yourself, is the willingness to put an ending in place, to draw the line and simply, quietly, step into your own life again. Direct confrontation in New York. The city of New York had always been a place of reinvention, a towering latticework of ambition, anonymity, and the unyielding heartbeat of millions. But for Susan Miller, the flight home after her Tokyo ordeal felt like crossing an invisible frontier. This time she didn't return as a mother anticipating comfort or reconciliation. She returned bearing the truth, and with it, a hard-earned clarity that transformed her gentle resolve into quiet steel. News of her arrival was not quietly received. The authorities had done their part. John and Hannah, stunned by the collapse of their careful facade abroad, were now under official scrutiny. Investigations churned quietly in the background. Still, Susan knew some confrontations could not be left to lawyers or detectives. There are wounds, she supposed, that require direct exposure to begin to heal, or at least to close for good. The apartment's creamy walls glowed with late spring sunlight as Susan entered, her keys cold and heavy in her palm. She set down her carry-on by the door, no longer trusting anyone to handle her luggage but herself, and glanced at the familiar sweep of the living room. Everything was immaculate, as if to remind her that despite the seismic shifts, some environments can be preserved, even as the heart of them changes forever. That evening, John appeared as if summoned by fate. A text, a phone call, and then the almost desperate ring at her door. When she recognized his silhouette through the frosted glass, Susan didn't hesitate. She opened the door and met his gaze, her eyes sharper than the Manhattan skyline at dusk. He stepped inside with a haggard look. His veneer of corporate composure was threadbare now, replaced by guilt and agitation. Hannah had chosen not to come, perhaps protective of herself, or perhaps because even in this moment, some battles could only be waged between parent and child. "Susan, Mom, please let me explain," he began, his voice faltering, as rehearsed as any closing argument he'd made in a boardroom. He motioned to the living room, but she remained by the entryway, arms folded, feet planted firmly as if anchoring herself to the floor. "I know what you and Hannah tried to do," Susan said quietly. There was no anger in her tone, just a cold, measured finality. "I read your messages. I saw your plan." For a moment John seemed too stunned to speak. The city's sounds filtered in from the windows, sirens, cab horns, a catalog of normalcy starkly at odds with the unraveling inside the apartment. He tried again. We didn't mean for it go that far. I was desperate. After Dad died, everything fell apart. The bills, the business. Hannah just... Don't justify her," Susan cut in, not harsh, simply done with obfuscation. "Or yourself. I am not a relic for you to pawn off when life gets hard." He slumped slightly, and in the giving out of his shoulders she recognized the boy he once was, fragile, in need, shaped by circumstance. That sympathy rose, unbidden, but Susan quelled it. Forgiveness, she now believed, could be weaponized against those most willing to surrender to old patterns. "I gave you everything I could," she continued softly, her words weaving through the silence. "But there are lines you crossed that I can't erase, not with time, not with apologies. Trust is not a birthright." John ran a trembling hand through his hair, trying and failing to gather composure. "What happens now?" he asked, voice nearly breaking. She met his eyes. "Now you need to face the full truth, the police, the consequences, and you'll do it without my protection. I've already changed my will. I have taken every precaution. You will not find sanctuary here, not in law, not in family." There was a silence so deep Susan could hear her own breathing, the clock hands moving in the next room. Tears stood in John's eyes, not the dramatic weeping of a man seeking loopholes, but the flat despair of loss truly understood. "I hope," she finished, her voice low, "you find your way, and that losing me isn't the end of you, but the beginning of your becoming someone better. But this is the end of us, as mother and son. I have to survive as much from you as anyone in this world." She ushered him gently to the door, her hands trembling but her spirit unbroken. As he stepped back into the corridor, all of Manhattan and its histories of endings and reinventions seemed to press into their small goodbye. For Susan, it was not triumph, it was release. When the door closed, she leaned against it for a long, silent minute, feeling the old ache of grief threading with the new strength of no longer being afraid, no longer waiting for someone else to save her peace. Outside, the city roared, uncaring, and inside Susan's heart, a new era was beginning, solitary, resolute, and finally, her own. The collapse of the traitors. In the relentless symphony of New York, where steel towers cast long shadows over secrets and scandal, the consequences of betrayal unfold with a gravity all their own. For John and Hannah, whose schemes had been so meticulously plotted and executed halfway around the world, it was as if their entire world had been built on a glass foundation, stunning to behold, but fated to shatter at the faintest tremor of truth. Word of their failed plot and international disgrace spread swiftly, not only among family and former friends, but also through legal and professional circles where both had previously moved with a kind of untouchable confidence. The court of public opinion, always hungry for a scandal, pounced. Their names were whispered in conference rooms and splashed across news tickers, details leaking out in fragments that slowly built a damning portrait. American heiress targeted by son and daughter-in-law in Tokyo conspiracy, the headlines all but wrote themselves, and with every click their social and professional credibility crumbled a little further. John was the first to face the music. His employer, an influential financial firm, swiftly placed him on indefinite leave pending the outcome of investigations into his conduct and fitness for fiduciary responsibility. No client could stomach entrusting their nest egg to a man proven willing to orchestrate his elderly mother's disappearance overseas for profit. His phone rang with calls from reporters, but most often it was lawyers, his own, his firm's, even those representing nervous clients, voicing disbelief and, ultimately, dismissal. Professional designations and club memberships vanished faster than he could sign apology letters. The friends he'd considered loyal distanced themselves at warp speed. The few who stayed did so more out of morbid curiosity than genuine support. Hannah, too, found herself rapidly isolated. Invitations to luncheons, art openings, charity boards, her entire social calendar evaporated within days. The toxic residue of scandal clung to her, unshakable. Even her family turned cold, with phone numbers going unanswered and childhood friends citing busy schedules, unavailable for the foreseeable future. In her airy, now haunted apartment, Hannah began to discover the unique loneliness reserved for those who not only break trust, but are discovered in the act, a modern pariah, her identity now inextricably tangled with cowardice and greed. Every attempt to spin her involvement as misjudgment or emotional manipulation was met with skepticism and, when pressed, outright derision. The legal consequences soon eclipsed the social ones. With Susan's detailed records, corroborated by international authorities, the criminal case against John and Hannah was airtight. Both faced charges related to conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted elder abuse, and, chillingly, the intent to orchestrate a disappearance for financial gain. Courtrooms in both Manhattan and Tokyo hummed with speculation. Prosecutors, eager to make an example of the pair, wielded digital evidence like a sword. No amount of legal maneuvering could erase the text messages, the bank queries, and the mountain of circumstantial evidence they'd so carelessly left behind. Their lawyers argued coercion, stress, misunderstanding, anything to chip away at the stone of public outrage. But the narrative would not bend. They had plotted, together, against blood and bond. The judge's gavel came down with resounding finality. Those spared the maximum sentence by plea bargains and displays of contrition in courtroom statements, they each received terms that would forever mark their record and their future employment opportunities. Community service, probation, mandatory counseling. The punishments might seem light to those watching, but to John and Hannah, who had built their lives on a foundation of privilege and deception, it was devastating. Neither would ever recover what they'd lost, not just family and fortune, but the invisible networks of trust and reputation that had once carried them through the world as if on a magic carpet. In the years that followed, even after appeals and supervised releases, the sting of collective memory persisted. Their names, once mere signatures on event programs or memos, became cautionary bywords and whispered warnings. Be careful. Betrayal is never worth the price. In the end, it's not just the targets who pay, but those who try to destroy what is sacred for gain. New life, rebirth. After suffering. After Susan's harrowing ordeal, New York no longer felt like the same city. The skyline's sharp beauty, the clamor of traffic, the thrum of possibility on every street corner, these were all still there, but seen now through a wiser, more somber lens. The pain of betrayal was not something that melted away with time, nor even with justice. It was a daily companion, subtle and insistent, reshaping her sense of self and her vision for the future. She started small. Morning walks in Central Park were once again part of her ritual, but with a new purpose. Each breath was a declaration of survival, a measured act of reclaiming the landscape that once brought her solace. She would walk past familiar monuments and unfamiliar faces, coat collar turned up, eyes scanning for the colors of spring, and allow herself moments of serenity without apology. She enrolled in a painting class at a local community center, her brushstrokes at first cautious, then, on a bright afternoon when the light caught just so, fearless. Friendship too began to take on new meaning. The connections Susan formed after the ordeal were more carefully chosen, more deeply appreciated. There were lunches with Dana, who by some twist of fate accepted a transfer to an American Airlines New York office, laughter over shared memories of Tokyo's chaos, and once in a while, a silence between them that was comforting rather than charged. Susan also reached out to a local women's support group, not in the spirit of confession, but as a gesture of solidarity, strength seeking strength. In her story, others found not just drama or scandal but inspiration, a woman who would not break, who now set boundaries as confidently as she once signed checks. Her home became her sanctuary, its rooms filled with evidence of a life not just resumed but rewritten. She updated every document, her will, her medical directives, her keyholder list, with a clear head and a steady hand. She changed the locks not out of paranoia but out of principle. The balcony garden flourished under her renewed attention, thickening with lavender and hyacinth, perfume she associated with resilience. Perhaps most profound was the way Susan changed inwardly. Trust, once given as a familial default, was now something to be earned, and she was unapologetic about drawing hard lines even with people she loved. But there was no bitterness in her boundaries, only a lucid respect for herself and the fragility of her hard-won peace. She traveled too, this time on her own terms. A solitary trip to Maine's rocky coast, an art retreat in Santa Fe, yoga mornings and wine evenings in California's Sonoma Valley. None of these trips were about escape. Instead, they reflected a deep curiosity about who she could become, unencumbered by the fear of loss. Susan kept a journal, not just of destinations, but of tiny victories. Today I spoke to a stranger without rehearsing every word. Today I felt free. The world itself seemed to bend toward renewal. News stories about her case stopped arriving, replaced by articles on senior empowerment, stories of women reclaiming their autonomy, features on trust and self-protection. Occasionally Susan would receive a letter, sometimes from a stranger, sometimes from someone in her old bridge club, expressing admiration for her strength or seeking advice on navigating heartbreak. These she answered thoughtfully, surprised to find wisdom growing from the same ground where her hurt had once thrived. She even made peace with solitude. On evenings when loneliness crept in, she didn't resist. She set a good table for herself, poured a glass of wine, put on Gershwin or Ella Fitzgerald, and let the city's nighttime glow soothe her edges. What had once been a space of waiting for visitors, for calls, for the past to forgive itself, became a canvas for new beginnings. What Susan created ultimately was a quiet life with an unbreakable core. She knew she would always carry the scars of betrayal, but she refused to let them define her or draw boundaries around the rest of her days. Whenever anyone asked if she regretted putting an end to forgiveness, she smiled and replied, "No, sometimes self-respect is the greatest kindness we can offer, to ourselves and even to those who hurt us." Through each season's turn, Susan discovered new meanings in pleasure and pride: the texture of fresh linen, the first taste of tomatoes from her windowsill, the delicate chaos of a city that kept offering new chances. She owned this renewal, step by step and moment by moment, until one morning she looked in the bathroom mirror, traced the lines at her temples, and saw not only survival, but transformation. In this new life, Susan Miller was no longer just a survivor. She was her own protector, her fiercest advocate, and most importantly, a woman unafraid to embrace the future on her own terms. Spreading impact and reflection. In the quiet wake of chaos, the story of Susan Miller did not simply recede into the shadows of private memory. It moved like a stone dropped in water, sending concentric waves outward, touching people and places in ways Susan herself could not have foreseen. Word of her ordeal, once a tightly guarded secret whispered only among close friends, eventually became fodder for broader discussion, not as a tabloid spectacle but as a study in survival and the cost of trust betrayed. Articles appeared in community newsletters and senior advocacy blogs, dissecting her case as a warning and, more importantly, as an emblem of resilience. Invitations arrived for Susan to speak, at local centers, then online panels dealing with elder rights, the complexities of inheritance, or even the navigation of family conflict in the golden years. Each retelling wasn't mere repetition. It became a tool for other women and men to measure their boundaries, to see self-preservation as a form of dignity rather than abandonment. The impact spread through the city's veins, especially within the networks of aging New Yorkers, where Susan's example became shorthand for a difficult, necessary conversation. Book clubs and coffee clatches discussed the dangers relatives may pose, not out of paranoia but out of hard-earned practicality. Law firms updated seminars for clients, adding case studies about toxic dependence and safeguarding one's assets later in life. For those who had always been taught to forgive without exception, Susan's choice to draw a line inspired a recalibration of loyalty and self-worth. But the ripples did not stop at the boundaries of Susan's city or even her age group. Unexpectedly, younger generations, those tuned in through social media or university symposiums, found resonance in her narrative. They saw in Susan's journey a mirror for their own challenges, standing firm against the pressures of family expectation, asserting autonomy, and rejecting manipulation masquerading as care. For many, her refusal to forgive at any cost was radical, even liberating. It broadened the conversation about boundaries beyond blood, raising the question of what we owe to ourselves versus what is owed to others. Susan herself received letters, some from strangers across the country, others from a few blocks away. They wrote not merely to congratulate her, for she did not seek or savor heroics, but to share stories of quiet battles and difficult escapes. One woman described cutting ties with a sibling after discovering financial duplicity. A man recounted the struggle to set limits with adult children. The common thread was not bitterness, but a new pride in drawing firm lines where once there were only obligations. Susan read each letter with care, sometimes answering with a few handwritten words, always supportive, never prescriptive. It was in these moments of reflection that Susan understood her legacy was not the sum of her professional accomplishments, or even her material bequests, but the permission her story had granted others. Permission to protect themselves. Permission to let go of destructive loyalties. Permission to shape their futures from a place of strength, not fear. The lessons of her ordeal rarely surfaced as open scars, but lingered instead as subtle, decisive shifts in posture. The way she looked people in the eye, the confidence with which she now claimed her solitude, the kindness she extended without surrendering her own ground. Occasionally in the hush after twilight, Susan would find herself drawn back into memory, the sharpness of betrayal now softened by time. Sometimes she relived that cold clarity on the plain, or the hard ache in her chest as she watched John's silhouette disappear down the hallway. And yet, rather than haunting her, these recollections fortified her. They reminded her of the cost of ignoring instinct, but more importantly of the profound power in survival, not just for herself but for everyone who would come after. Through every season, Susan came to cherish reflection itself, not as dwelling on the past, but as the act of shaping the present with wisdom won through pain. Every time she caught the city's reflection in a puddle or window pane, she knew that each story, her own included, sent ripples well beyond its origin. Some wounds might never heal, but the choices she had made sent forward an enduring message, that one woman's refusal to be broken could light the path for many, long after the drama had faded from the headlines. The true impact of her ordeal was neither in headlines nor court transcripts but in the lives quietly altered by her strength and resolve.